Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on which countries are stepping up climate action ahead of COP26. We will wait another minute or so for everyone to come in and we will get started. All right, well, thank you all again for joining today's webinar on which countries are stepping up climate action ahead of COP26. We'll hear today from presenters talking about the recent UNFCCC synthesis report on NDCs submitted thus far, what countries are doing and where they may go, and how WRI's online data source, Climate Watch, can provide more detailed information on NDCs. Our presenters today, and we'll get to them in a moment, will be Tugba Ichmeli from the UNFCCC Secretariat, Taryn Franzen from WRI's Climate Program, and Mengping Ge from WRI's Climate Watch team. Following the presentations, we'll have a Q&A session. We hope you'll engage with that, and please feel free to start putting your questions in the Q&A chat box at any time, and we'll also have an opportunity to do so later. So before we jump into those presentations, let me first start with a little bit of context, a brief context setter. I'm sure many of you saw the headlines a little over a week ago about the UNFCCC synthesis report on the updated NDCs that have come in so far. Those are the nationally determined contributions that reflect countries' climate commitments for 2030. And the synthesis report covered those that had come in by the end of 2020. And for really good reason. As you see here, the headlines were really worrisome. Some of the words there, dire, red alert, too meager, and all of that is absolutely right. But that stark warning isn't yet the end of the story. And we also need to look ahead to the rest of this year leading up to COP26, which is taking place in Glasgow in November. And there's still much to play for. It's a critical year ahead, and there's much at stake in what comes next over the 8 months ahead. Countries representing 3/4 of global emissions have yet to submit updated NDCs or have said they'll resubmit what they put forward last year. So much more to come over the course of this year, and really quite a lot at stake. We'll hear a bit more on that later in the webinar. What's the context for these NDCs? How did we get to where we are? As you see in this illustration, we're on an arc of ambition out to 2050 and where we need to go in terms of net zero emissions. It's an arc that decisively goes through 2030. That's the date at which most NDCs are pointed right now, the ones that are on the table. And it's also the date by which the IPCC has said that global emissions must roughly be cut in half. So a key moment on that arc. Under the Paris Agreement, as I'm sure you're aware, countries are expected to return every 5 years to enhance and strengthen their commitments to climate action that are reflected in their NDCs. And last year was, of course, the first 5-year moment. The first moment along that arc. But understandably, a number of countries were delayed in preparing their NDCs given the COVID crisis. So the key time frame we're now facing is November, this November, COP26. And that's the moment by which we really do need to see updated NDCs that put us on the right course. And together, the NDCs are going to they need to put us closer to a pathway that does get us on track for that net zero emissions point by mid-century and keeping temperature change limited to 1.5 degrees. We've seen tremendous momentum this past year in terms of net zero emissions and commitments to those. But you can't get to 2050, of course, without going through 2030. And NDCs are going to have to do much better in putting us on track. This graph that you see right here is just a very simple illustration of the challenge that has to be tackled. This is indeed just illustrative, I want to make that clear, but it shows an example of a current NDC, the red dot, and the linear trajectory that would be needed from 2018 level of emissions to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 for this sort of illustrative country. As you can see, that red dot, that NDC is not yet in line with that net zero trajectory, and it would need to be strengthened. Of course, linear trajectories are really a very simple way of showing this. Optimally, in fact, countries need to be on much steeper slopes sooner to cut their emissions so that we can keep within the carbon budgets that we need for 1.5 degrees. But I think this gives a clear sense of what's needed. And it's in fact the case for many, many countries that their NDCs right now are not in line with what we need for net zero or 1.5 degrees. So this year will be a key test for the world for taking stronger action. The NDCs ahead will be a key test. And we need that stronger action in order to limit dangerous climate change and also to reap the immediate economic development and health benefits that we can see from that action. So without further ado, with that as our task, with that as our challenge, I'd like to now turn to our presenters. And let me start with Tugba Ichmeli. She's a program officer at the UNFCCC in the Transparency Division there in the UNFCCC Secretariat. She's responsible for providing support and technical assistance to developing countries on their preparation for the enhanced transparency framework, and that's part of the Paris Agreement and the rules that have come from there, and also the preparation and communication of their nationally determined contributions. So without further ado, to tell us a bit about that synthesis report that came out and gave us all a bit of a warning a little over a week ago, let's turn to Tugba.
So thank you, David. Thank you for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. So yes, as David introduced, my name is Tugba Ichmeli. So, and I would, first of all, I would like to thank you all for giving me this opportunity to speak to you today on this very pressing and important topic, actually. So today I will share with you the key findings from this report, but before coming to that, please let me quickly provide you with a bit of context around the report. So in my next slide, you can see that actually the year, last year, 2020, was a rather special year for the UNFCCC process because it was considered as a start of the full NDC process, starting with the NDC submissions, which is to be followed by their tracking of the implementations under the ETF, and then completing the assessment of the collective progress at the global stocktake. So that was what we see the round or the process of the NDCs in the secretary. But the process, the UNFCCC process in 2020 was actually planned in accordance with these expectations, of course. We expected to receive new and updated NDCs from almost all parties before Glasgow. So we would have a synthesis report before everyone, before the parties in the Glasgow to be prepared by us. But as we all are aware, the things unfortunately did not develop quite as well we planned. So the spread of the global pandemic had a drastic impact also on the international climate change process. The preparation of new or updated NDCs unfortunately delayed in many countries, and no formal UNFCCC climate conferences took place in 2020 as well, including the COP. So the COP was now postponed to the end of this year. And obviously we did not prepare the synthesis report in 2020, and instead we just prepared and published it in 2021. So in my next slide, you can also see that with that context, now I can come to the NDC synthesis report. Our mandate to prepare this report actually comes from the Paris COP, which was held in 2015. So it was like almost 5 years ago. And as it is quoted here in the first box, you can see that the quite important is that the mandate refers to the need to facilitate the clarity, the transparency and understanding of these NDCs. And this requirement had its implications, of course, for the content of the report, we will see in a moment. But knowing that the preparation of these new or updated NDCs was much impacted by the COVID pandemic, and taking into account the postponement of the Glasgow COP to the end of this year, we took the decision to issue the NDC synthesis report in 2 versions. So the initial version was published by the end of February, and it only took on board the new and updated NDCs submitted by 21st of December 2020. So we only took on board those ones communicated to us until the end of last year. But nevertheless, we will have a final version which will be published before Glasgow, so everyone can have more information and other NDCs to be submitted this year as well in 2021. And as planned, of course, this version of the synthesis report covers 75 parties, including EU and its 27 member states. And these represent about like 40% of the 191 parties to the Paris Agreement. So there are still quite a few NDC revisions which may come later, we expect. Also, please note that these 75 NDCs account for about 30% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. Well, this is not too little, but not also enough for a credible global assessment. Therefore, we will do such assessment in the final version. But on the other hand, what we see, even with this partial estimate, has its value, and we see that quite well with this initial version. So next slide, please. Here you see the first page of the report, how it looks like, and it is already available on our website, and the link showed on this slide. And in addition to the synthesis report, I also would like to highlight that there are 3 technical addendums covering additional information on what parties communicated, especially in particular on adaptation, on their domestic mitigation measures, as well as on the contribution of these NDCs collectively to the long-term objectives of the Convention and the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. So here you see the contents page, second page of the report, and in substance, the report covers the synthesized information under the topics of the ICTU elements. So if you are not very familiar with this process, the ICTU elements are the basic information elements to be presented in NDCs. And these are you can see it from A to I, actually. I will not read them all, don't worry. So that's how we structured the report. And this is also to respond properly to the mandate, which I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago. So then within the report, we also have some information chapters on adaptation, on mitigation, and also on means of implementation to further elaborate contributions from these parties as captured within their updated NDCs. So in the next slide, please, we can see what this report tells us actually. So I would like to start with some good news, because we really do see some positive and meaningful trends actually through this cycle of new or updated NDCs in comparison with the previous initial NDCs from 2015 or 2016. For example, the quality of the information presented in these NDCs really has grown significantly. And we see that now parties are paying more attention to the planning and implementation processes, including the engagement of various social layers, including non-state actors or any other stakeholders. And the third point will be that what we see is that the NDC commitments are now becoming more linked with longer-term goals or aspirations to achieving carbon neutrality in the future with sustainable development goals and also with national legislative, regulatory, and planning processes. So we see them very important and good news, because now we think that parties are really thinking how to implement their NDCs, and it is actually very important in this process. And each of these bullets is quite big, and all of them mean that parties take NDC preparation and implementation seriously and demonstrating their commitments to the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. So in our report, we also conducted an assessment of where all these NDCs, of course, taken collectively, lead us in terms of to the goals of the Paris Agreement. And that's where the news becomes, unfortunately, less good. So we know, notably from the IPCC special report, that global greenhouse gas emissions should decline sharply by 2030 in comparison with 2010. To us, to be on path to limiting this temperature increase by 1.45 or even 2 degrees Celsius. But what we see for now is that the NDCs as given are currently leading us to more or less a stabilization of emissions at the levels of 2010. So because you see from the slide, it would be like 1.5% lower than the emission levels in 2010 by 2030. But and this is unfortunately not in the order of what the IPCC sets, because the IPCC indicates that such reductions should be in the order of 25 to 40%. So this shows very visibly that the climate action needs to be strengthened urgently. So the next slide, please. So what we see we see this report is definitely a warning, because if you want to see much deeper reductions in 2030, action needs to be taken now, given the time need for a meaningful action to get converted into real emission reductions, because what we plan now will not be realized tomorrow. So it is a process and it will take some time. And of course, we know that this is based on this analysis, I mean, is based on only a subset of countries, as I mentioned. And we hope that the full report to be available before Glasgow may or may not modify this picture. So we will capture all those well before Glasgow. But in any case, the full report will provide a different picture only if the NDCs, which are still to come, show a notably different trend in the anticipated emissions by 2030. So and we believe that this picture can be influenced also if some of the countries who already submitted an NDC update in 2020 could take another look at their commitments and, if possible, even strengthen these commitments, because this is actually possible within the Paris Agreement. And before I conclude, I would like to just also highlight two more points before I finish. So first of all, first one is that yes, many NDC updates got a delay because of COVID impact, COVID pandemic, but that impact also creates an opportunity to recover better in a more environmental healthy way. And the NDC revisions available so far have not yet addressed that opportunity, but we hope that those will be more visible in the NDC updates or new updates, new NDCs submitted in this year, at least to some extent. And my second point would be that for many countries, the degree of action in terms of mitigation is closely linked with the availability of support, not only in finance, but also in technology transfer and also capacity building. So support is a very important part of the UNFCCC process, and we should remember that very well also in the content of our report and the ambition put forward by the parties. So I hope, I really do hope that this year will indeed become a year of significant and meaningful enhancement in climate action. And in Glasgow, it will make more clear, Glasgow will make it clear that the objectives of the Paris Agreement are achievable and will be achieved. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Tuba. That was extremely helpful, I think, giving us a sense of the warning, as I mentioned earlier, that warning sign, and also the challenge that's ahead, giving us some sense of some of the positive steps that were taken, some of the ways in which countries improve the quality of their NDCs, and then also pointing out the opportunities ahead, including some of the social and health and development opportunities that can be seized over the coming year. So thank you very much for that. We'll turn now to Tarn Franzen with WRI's climate program. She's a senior fellow in the program, and her work is focused on long-term strategies and also the enhancement of NDCs. And she'll give us a sense of what's going on with specific countries and what happened last year and what we might look ahead to this year. Over to you, Tarn.
Thank you so much, David. So as Tuba mentioned, the mandate of the Secretariat is to sort of add up everything that is coming in from the NDCs and understand the global trends that those NDCs will result in. But WRI's mandate is a little bit different. And so we're going to be peeling back the layers here and looking at some of the country by country cases that are leading to the kinds of global impacts that Tuba mentioned in her presentation. So just to get started, and I guess in doing so, we're going to preview a little bit of the Climate Watch data that Mung Pin will be going into in detail next. So to get started, here we have a map of the status of NDC submissions in this round. So the yellow countries are those countries that have already submitted a document in this current 2020 round of NDCs. The blue countries have signaled their intent in this round to enhance their ambition or action in new and updated NDCs. So we are expecting submissions from these blue countries as well, hopefully in the lead up to COP26. And the gray countries haven't necessarily signaled that they're not going to. We just, they haven't given an indication yet. Now of these yellow countries that have submitted a document, relative to the last round of NDCs, we are seeing a lot of improvement in many ways. And I think Tuba touched on some of those trends. We are seeing more transparent NDCs. We are seeing countries that have taken on an economy-wide greenhouse gas reduction target for the first time. We are seeing more clarity in terms of the planning and implementation processes, et cetera. So there's a lot of qualitative improvement in this batch of NDCs, and I would certainly expect that to continue in those that are still to come. Now, I want to show on the next slide an indication of the quantitative changes in these NDCs. So these orange countries, in the last slide, they were yellow countries. Now they're orange because these are the places where we can definitively detect that emissions in 2030 under the new NDC will be lower than they were going to be under the previous NDC. So these are cases where we had enough transparency in both the first and the newer updated NDC to actually make that quantitative comparison. That wasn't the case for all countries, particularly a lot of smaller and least developed countries were working with limited data in the first round. So just because a country is not orange on this map doesn't mean that they haven't made improvements in mitigation ambition, but we can't quantify it. So just wanted to highlight some of the limitations that we're working with there in terms of where we can and cannot quantify the impact of this NDC update process. Now on the next slide, we're going to zoom in a little bit on the top emitters that have submitted a document in 2020. And here we have GHG emissions in 2030 on the y-axis. And then these top emitting countries that have submitted NDCs on the x-axis. And the blue bars are what 2030 emissions were going to be under the previous NDCs, and the orange bars are what they're projected to be under the new NDCs. So you can see in some cases, like in the EU, there has been a significant decrease in 2030 emissions under the new NDC, same for Argentina and the UK. In Brazil, it's gone the opposite direction. And then in several countries, it has stayed the same. And we know that we need to see a lot of decline in order to meet those IPCC benchmarks. So this is going to show, this is going to give some indication of why the numbers are not adding up. So let's take a look at the next slide now. This is showing on the y-axis the percent change in 2030 emissions from the old NDC to the new NDC. And you can see on the left, two countries and a region that made significant declines in their updates. And then on the right, countries whose new NDCs will actually have more emissions than the previous NDCs. Brazil obviously stands out as an outlier here. Mexico also has a slight increase. And I just want to mention where that's coming from. Both of those countries kept the same greenhouse gas target from their old NDC to the new NDC, but they changed the reference point from which that reduction is being measured. So in Mexico's case, their target is framed as a % reduction from a baseline scenario. And in their updated NDC, they updated their baseline scenario to be slightly higher than it was in the old NDC. So what that translates into is that when you then take the same % reduction from a higher number, you end up with a higher number. In Brazil's case, the situation is somewhat similar, except that their target is framed as a reduction, as a % reduction from a base year. And in Brazil's case, they updated their base year inventory, and that made base year emissions significantly higher than they were first estimated. And this is a little bit tricky because it's not at all uncommon for countries to update their inventories. Most countries do this on a regular basis. It's unusual to have changes that are quite so dramatic as this. We do want to be encouraging, of course, countries to use more robust and improved methodologies in their inventories, but we also want to be encouraging deeper ambition and GHG reductions over time. So a bit of a sticky situation there with Brazil. Looking at the next slide, this is showing essentially the same thing, except y-axis is in absolute value of CO2 equivalent rather than in % reduction. So you can sort of see here how the green bars cumulatively compare to the orange bars cumulatively, and get a sense why, despite fairly considerable improvements in ambition from some countries, we're not seeing the magnitude of improvement globally that we need to be seeing. And a limitation of this slide is that we are just looking at the highest emitters here. If you start adding up the smaller countries, that obviously has an impact as well. So just to give a flavor, if you add up all of the countries in the Latin American and Caribbean region that have submitted enhanced targets, they're somewhere just short of 300 megatons of CO2e, around 276. Minus 276, I should say, going from the old NDCs to the new NDCs. So that's a little bit larger value than the UK. So if you added them up, you would have another green bar here that would be actually the second biggest, just behind the EU. So, the leadership of small countries is important as well, and it does add up. We're just taking somewhat of a simplified approach here by looking at the largest emitting countries. So let's go ahead and look at the next slide. This is sort of, this is showing the percent of global emissions that are accounted for by the countries that have submitted NDCs to date in this round, and those that have not. So I'd like you to look first at the inner circle, the dark green and the dark orange. And you can see that just shy of countries representing just shy of 30% of global emissions have submitted so far, which leaves over 70% still to come in the dark orange. And additionally, there's a part of that dark green wedge, which is represented by the blue wedge, which are countries that have submitted already, but have said that they are going to resubmit. So there's scope still for those countries to come back and contribute more than is being reflected in these numbers to date. Of course, any country can decide to do that. Those are just the countries that have indicated that they actually will. So when you add up the countries that have not submitted yet, plus that additional 4%, you get to around three quarters of global emissions that are still left to play for this year. So there's quite a lot at stake in the coming months. There's quite a lot of potential left, and it will be important to keep all eyes on what that remaining 75% of global emissions does. So let's look at the next slide. I want to turn now to kind of what is ahead and what we might expect. This slide is showing which countries have communicated a net zero emissions pledge by mid-century. We see that basically countries in any color on this map have a pledge of some kind. The yellow ones have net zero as actually part of domestic law. Blue countries have a net zero target as part of a policy document, which could be a long-term strategy or an NDC under the Paris Agreement, or it could be some other policy document domestically other than a law. And the orange countries are those that have made a political pledge to achieve net zero at the head of state or cabinet level. And that includes countries like Canada, Argentina, China, many of the countries that made announcements at the Climate Ambition Summit back in December. And what I want to highlight here is that a number of these countries with net zero pledges haven't yet submitted an NDC in this round. And if those countries are going to be taking their net zero pledges seriously, they will be putting big improvements in their NDCs, because as David was highlighting earlier, you can't get to 2050 or mid-century without going to 2030. You need to be getting on that emissions trajectory now in the next decade for those long-term pledges to really be credible. So I think and hope that we will see significant improvements from some of these countries that have made net zero pledges. Of course, that still remains to be seen. So on the next slide, two of the biggest ones to watch, the first and second largest current emitter in the US and China. So in the context of the US, our modeling indicates that the Biden administration could put forward a target of on the order of 50% reduction from 2005 by 2030. In China, our analysis indicates that they could advance their peaking year from 2030 to 2026 and also make significant targets that would aim for significant reduction in non-CO2 emissions, because the current peak year target and intensity target in China's current NDC only covers CO2, and China's non-CO2 emissions add up to if China's non-CO2 emissions were their own country, they would be in the top 10 emitters right there. So it's important to cover non-CO2 emissions as well. So those are two of the indicators that we're going to be watching going forward in the NDCs yet to come. Now, on the next slide, I want to spotlight several countries that have adopted net zero targets, 3 of which have already submitted NDCs without enhanced ambition. That's Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand. And then Canada's is still to come. So the Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand are 3 of those countries that were in the blue wedge that I showed earlier, countries who have submitted NDCs but have said that they will come back and do better. So hopefully we will see new NDCs from those countries that bring their trajectories closer into alignment with net zero emissions. And then hopefully Canada's submission, when it comes, will do the same. On the next slide, these are a handful of countries that I would consider to be somewhat wild cards when it comes to their NDCs. Haven't given a lot of indication yet of what they might put forward in this round, if anything. But these are G20 countries that are major emitters. And so they are ones to watch as well, but a little bit less of an idea about what to expect there. And then finally, on my last slide, these are countries that have already come forward with NDCs in this round that either make no improvement, or no meaningful improvement, or actually backslide from the previous round. So will we see a reconsideration on the part of any of these countries? None of them have indicated that they'll come back to the table with additional commitments, but countries are always at liberty to do so. So there's always scope for that to happen, and hopefully it will in certain cases to get us closer to those global numbers that we need to be seeing. So with that, I will conclude my presentation. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Tara, and thank you very much for walking through all of that with specific countries in that detail and giving us a sense of where we've gotten to and where we might be headed. We're going to turn now to Mungpin Get. She's an associate in WRI's Global Climate Program, and she leads work for Climate Watch, our online data base and tool, many purposes. Please do check it out online. And Mungpin leads the analytical work and also the way in which our tools are put up and are deployed. So over to you, Mungpin.
Sorry, trying to find the unmute button. Hi, everyone, and thank you, David. So in my part of the webinar today, I will be demoing a few modules of Climate Watch and show you where you can find the relevant data points that we have been discussing today and how you can navigate and use the tools to better understand the country's climate actions. I'm now on the homepage of Climate Watch, and a short note on the background, if you're not familiar, Climate Watch is an online open data platform managed by our team at the World Resources Institute and together with our partners. Our data offering centers really around countries' climate progress and actions, and we offer those informations through curated country and sectoral profile pages and dedicated modules on countries' climate commitments and their historical greenhouse gas emissions. So the focus of the demo today is really the commitments module, and we will look at 3 of the tools, and I'll demonstrate the key functionalities where you might find relevant information on NDCs and how you can navigate across the tools. The first page of today is really for those of you who are looking for the big numbers, and this is the 2020 NDC tracker. From the name, you can really imagine that we launched the tool in 2019 with the intention to look at the big 2020 moment and started to keep track of countries' intention to update and enhance their new round of NDCs in 2020. And as countries submit their new NDCs, we have also been updating the tracker regularly with new submissions. So to recap the big numbers again on the left panel here, 74 countries or 75 parties to account for European Union have submitted their new round of NDCs. And those countries represent around 30% of global emissions. And in addition to this, we have over 80 countries who emits around half of global emissions have also stated their intention to enhance ambition or action in their new NDCs. And this really includes some of the top emitters like China and the US that Taryn has been introducing. And scrolling down here, we have the table view. And this is another reason that I'm introducing the 2020 NDC tracker first. And it is that this page also gives you quick access to the other two tools we are introducing today. And it can be done through the table underneath the map. The table reflects the detailed information on the map, and this includes, for example, the status of the NDC submission or intentions to submit, the statement or the target summary, and links to the statement or submission. And two features I use very frequently here with the table that might be helpful is that one, you can sort the table, for example, here by statement date to see what is the latest submission or statement made by the countries. And another thing you can do is that you can filter the table by searching for a keyword. And we will quickly do UK as an example here. So from here, if you click on a country's name, this will lead you to the second tool we will be looking at today. And this is the Explore NDCs tool and the country NDC page. For each of the NDCs, we have well over 100 indicators that we use to present countries' NDCs. And this is for easier understanding and comparison of those emissions. And the information are organized here under different categories and under topics of mitigation, adaptation, and sectoral information. And for those of you who are familiar, or you might recall from TalkBus presentation already, you might recognize that this the list here really follows the CTU elements to the extent possible. And for example, the time frame, the reference points for the GHG target, and the scope and coverage, the assumptions and methodologies for accounting, and many more. So going back to the 2020 NDC tracker and from the compare with previous submission here, and this will lead you to a view of the third functionality of today, and this is the comparison tool. The default category that we land from this link is to compare with previous NDC indicators. And this is a special set of indicators that we adopted from a WRI publication on the menu of options for NDC enhancement that Taryn is also a lead author of. And here we make the assessment that comparing to the previous version, did the new NDC included a strengthened or new GHG target, any enhancement in the sectoral targets, policies and actions, adaptation component, and if it provides any additional information for clarity, transparency, and understanding. And from here, this is where things get interesting, and we'll look at them one by one. So the second tool we're looking at today is the Explore NDCs module. And I would usually break it down into two components. One is the country NDC page that we're just looking at with UK as an example. And the second one is this landing map if you access directly from the menu bar. So the map we are looking here reflects the latest submission of each country. And this means that information mapped here is a collective summary of the previous rounds of NDCs, this new round of updated NDCs, and even INDCs for certain countries. And this is to present a full picture of the latest commitments by any given country. So on top here, we have around 40 indicators under 7 categories that we can choose from. And this again covers a lot of the CTU elements that might be of interest to you. And if we select, for example, the mitigation contribution type indicator as an example, we can really see just visually here that the vast majority of countries have a GHG target or both GHG and non-GHG target as their top line mitigation contribution in their NDCs. And from the donut chart here, we can also tell that around 90% of global emissions are represented by the countries that falls under the two categories collectively. And if you recall the structure from the 2020 NDC tracker, here is again a table underneath the map, and this reflects information of the selected indicator. And you can similarly have access to the country NDC view or comparison view from the country here. I'll do a quick, another quick example of, for example, Chile here. And now we are at the country NDC view again. So one of the important feature that we introduced last year in response to the new round of NDCs is the archived NDC analysis. So this means that we enable easy access to the previous NDC submissions and full analysis of those different versions of NDCs from the drop-down menu here. The default selection to the country page is always the latest submission. But for example, if we select the first NDC, and now we're looking at the analysis of Chile's first NDC submitted in 2017. From here, you might naturally have the question of how the new NDC compares with the previous submission again. And this is where this yellow comparison button is for. And it takes you directly to the search tool that we're looking at today. And we are again landed on this comparison view. So if I select very quickly, the first NDC and now Chile's updated first NDC. And again, this is the overview and the summary indicators of Chile's first and updated first NDC. And if this is too long to read, we can also look at the breakdown of the CTU elements that you can clearly see how the target types have been changing. It was a single year target in the first NDC, and now it's a multi-year target that really controls Chile's emission over the period of 2020 to 2030. So this leads us to the third and last page that I would like to make you aware of today. And this is another access point to the comparison function, and it can also be accessed through the top menu here. The compare all target page comes with this big table that we're looking at. And the table is designed to serve two use cases. And first is to give an overview of the existence of countries' climate commitments in forms of NDCs long-term strategies, or countries' climate targets in their domestic laws and legislations. And secondly, within the table, and guided by this overview, we are able to select any of the three documents to compare targets with. And this could be comparing different NDC submissions to see how ambition is changing over time. And this can also be comparing NDCs and long-term strategies to see how countries' medium-term and long-term targets are aligned. And we'll use the very friendly search function again and again using, for example, UK as an example. And from here, we'll select the updated NDC long-term strategy and a climate policy from UK. And we can see here, for example, the long-term strategy target and in UK's LTS actually reflects the targets in its Climate Action Act. So by having this comparison function on top of what we have already, we hope that together the tools will help the goal of Climate Watch to inform and drive climate action through increased transparency, understanding, and accountability of countries' efforts to address climate change, and to keep track of how ambitions are increased and can be increased over time. So time permitting, this wraps up a very quick demonstration of Climate Watch and three of the tools that might be most relevant for understanding and comparing countries' climate commitments. Over the course of this year, we will continue to keep our trackers updated with the new NDC submissions made by countries towards COP26. And I would like to also take this opportunity to invite you to check back regularly on Climate Watch and WRI for those updates. And we'll look forward to the next synthesis report. So if you would like to learn more about Climate Watch, please also feel free to reach out to Reese, who will put you in contact with the Climate Watch team. And we're keen to continue the conversations. And with this, I will stop sharing and hand over to David.
Great. Thank you very much, Mungpen. That was extremely helpful. Thanks for digging into those tools. I would encourage everybody to take a look at Climate Watch and really poke around to see what it is that countries are doing. You can explore quite a bit and get a lot of info there. We are going to turn to the question and answer session in just a moment. First, I just want to highlight, I think we have on a slide some of the resources online that you can access and get additional information from. And we'll also send that information about resources around. So I think that slide's not coming up, and given the time, I think we should turn to the Q&A. So let me begin, and thank you all very much for the questions that you've submitted. There's the resources slide, and we'll send that information around as well. Let me turn to Tuba with a couple of questions that came in about what countries in general have done in terms of the information included in their NDCs. So one was about net zero ambition and what's reflected in the NDCs in terms of net zero commitments or pledges. The other questions we've gotten are about some of the social dimensions. So how are the sustainable development goals reflected? There was a specific question about gender, in fact, what are we seeing on gender? And then question we'd received ahead of the webinar on just transition as well. And I'm happy to step on in that last item. But over to you, Tuba, for thoughts on these.
Thank you, David, and thank you for the questions. Actually, yes, nice to have more questions so we can explain more. So, for example, maybe I can start with some long-term goals, net zero or carbon neutrality. So actually many parties, like almost 50 out of 75 parties indicated or mentioned their goals or targets or already plans in place regarding their 2050 targets. They are, most of them are have aspirations to reach carbon neutrality up to or beyond 2050. So, and actually I should also indicate that in our synthesis report you can also find some information on how parties how this will impact the long-term emissions. For example, with the collective emission levels, with the parties who indicated such long-term carbon neutrality targets, we also find that the collective GHG emissions level of these set of parties actually could be 87 to 93% lower in 2050 when compared to 2017. So actually this is some good news as well for this set of parties, and we hope that this will be the trend also when we have the full picture. So, but the thing is, yes, more and more parties are now mentioning their long-term visions, long-term low emission development strategies or net zero goals in their NDCs, and even not, they are also communicating us their long-term low emission development strategies. It's another track under the UNFCCC process. So that would be my brief remarks on that. But of course, there are a lot to discuss around this topic, I guess. And and one more thing, because there was also a technical question about the emissions, which emissions we have taken into account to estimate these impacts. So on international GHG emissions, I would like to mention that the international transport, the emissions from the international transport were not included in the sum of emissions of the parties in their new or updated NDCs. But for the global totals for this report, we took into consideration their historical CO2 emissions only related to aviation and maritime transport. And we used that information to complement the country data to arrive at the global total. So that information can be also found very clearly in this synthesis report. And on other topics, so yes, we give an utmost importance to gender, also on many other topics like indigenous peoples, local communities, climate empowerment, and stakeholder engagement as well. And on gender, for example, I can highlight that parties are really increasingly considering gender in their NDCs, and they are recognizing gender integration actually as a means of increasing the ambition and also the effectiveness of their climate action. So we clearly show that in this cycle of NDCs, and actually the share of parties who mentioned gender in previous NDCs were like 23% of the 75. And now it increased to 80%. So this shows us a clear increase, a significant increase. And that's really important, I guess, and it is a really cross-cutting issue among the NDCs to be mentioned. So I hope I replied or responded these questions. If not, please just also feel free to send us any of your questions to ndc@unfcc.int. So it's our pleasure to respond any further question that can come over. Thank you. Over to you, David.
Thanks, Tuba. Your email inbox may start overflowing.
No worries.
Thank you for that invitation to do that. Yeah, and those were very helpful answers. Thank you. Just a quick addition to that. We've looked at just transition issues and how those are reflected, and 37 parties thus far have addressed issues related to just transition in their updated NDCs, and that's also a significant increase. So I think we see these social dimensions coming through quite strongly. And on Climate Watch, we do have a module that allows you to look at the connection between NDCs and the Sustainable Development Goals. So we're taking a look at that to see across the 17 SDGs how the linkages are reflected in NDCs. Let me turn to Tarn with a couple of questions. One was about countries that backslid in various ways or revised their baselines in ways that meant that their outcomes for 2030 are actually below what they would have been under the previous NDC. So the question is, in addition to Brazil, which countries are in that category of backsliders, essentially? The other question is around what's needed going forward, and what do we need to see from countries like the US and China and others in order to put us on a better course?
Sure. So on the backsliding issue, Brazil is by far the outlier just in terms of the magnitude of change in 2030 emissions from the old to the new NDC. That's on the basis, as I mentioned earlier, of updating their base year inventory. And also, as I mentioned, it is normal to update your inventories over time and to adopt more robust methodology. A number of developing countries are still sort of in that process. And developed countries also update their inventories, but the numbers tend to be a bit more stable since they've had longer to get on this path. And I think so we don't have a complete list yet of everyone who falls into that category. Mostly the change has been quite minor and quite trivial. Brazil sort of stands out in adding up to a really big number. There are not other examples on that magnitude that I'm aware of. Let's see, and then on the other question in terms of what's needed, I think the question asked specifically about the US and China. In the US, we'd like to see a target on the order of 50%, which we think is both ambitious and feasible on the basis of modeling that we have seen. And in China, we would like to see advancing the peak year to 2026 and incorporating non-CO2 targets. I think one thing that I want to mention more broadly in terms of these targets that countries are adopting for 2030, we of course want to get as much as we can out of this round in terms of ambition. And I think that we also need to recognize that there will likely still be a gap at the end of the year when we add up commitments like the ones that I just mentioned. That reflects political reality in many places that we need as a community to continually work to change. And the Paris Agreement, I think, sets up a very nice structure of asking countries to come back every 5 years, also giving them the flexibility to come back more frequently when that political reality does change, and technological reality as well. So those numbers that I mentioned are not the be all and end all of what we would ever want to see from those countries. It's intended to balance ambition and credibility and feasibility. Thank you.
Great, thank you. That's extremely helpful context to set, I think. Thank you for that. I think we might want to take a couple more questions, run over a couple minutes if our panelists can stay. And there have been some questions again about some of the particulars that countries included in their NDCs. So one on nature-based solutions and how those are reflected. Maybe Taryn, if you'd be able to take that. And one on adaptation and how adaptation is included. And maybe Tuva, that's something you could touch on, and Mungpin maybe direct folks to where also in Climate Watch they might be able to find some information on that.
Sure. So just briefly on nature-based solutions, there's a lot of interest in this in the Q&A box, and a lot of interest in it in NDCs as well. There are, excuse me, there are a number of countries. I don't have a complete total, but quite a lot of examples of nature-based solutions being incorporated in NDCs. Just to name a few, Colombia has articulated a commitment to net zero deforestation by 2030. It aims to plant 180 million trees by 2022. Kenya is aiming to achieve tree cover of 10%. And Moldova and Rwanda have also incorporated various forms of nature-based solutions in both mitigation and adaptation planning in their NDCs. So those are just some highlights, but there are many more examples as well.
Great. And on adaptation, over to you, Tuva.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, David. Yes, actually, we also looked into the information provided by parties in terms of adaptation as well as of means of implementation. So that's we, for example, 39 of these parties also somehow provided some information or their priority areas or sectors within the adaptation in their NDCs. And actually, 8 of them also indicated that these components as adaptation communications. So we also just synthesized this information in the synthesis report and also in the addendum on adaptation. Furthermore, to present all the examples of how they see the priority areas for specific adaptation measures. And if they have, for example, also some quantified targets, we also put some examples into these reports. So for that, actually, in terms of what information, so we already have, for example, in one of the decisions, we already have some guidance. So we looked into the impacts, the vulnerabilities, the actions, the measures to overcome adaptation needs, and that would be like briefly the information that we synthesized and provided in this synthesis report. But we see that more and more parties are now providing more information in terms of their vulnerabilities and also the priority actions they would like to take on board for in their NDCs.
Great, thank you. And Mungpin, if you'd be able to just very quickly mention to folks where they can find information on adaptation components.
Yeah, there are 2 places. One is in the map. There's a category on adaptation that you can choose indicators from. And also on each of the NDC country pages, there's a whole section on adaptation. And in addition to that, we also have sectoral adaptation actions, and those are hidden under the sectoral information.
Great, thank you very much. I think that concludes our Q&A today. Thank you to all the participants for the excellent questions. We will get back to all of those whose questions weren't answered. And please do feel free also to send us any additional follow-up questions you'd like to ask. We're very happy to do that. Just on one question that came through about the 43 countries that Taryn mentioned that did enhance their mitigation ambition, we are updating our NDC tracker, and so that will be reflected in the coming weeks. As soon as we're able to get that up, we are going to do so. As I said, do come back to us with any additional questions, including about the resources that we mentioned. And so let me just conclude by thanking all those who joined us today, and also to the panelists for the excellent presentations and responses. Thank you and have a good day.
Thanks.
Thank you.